I think we can all agree on one thing. The times you live in are truly awful. There's food shortages, runaway inflation, culture wars, real wars, race riots, fake news, insane insurrections, global pandemics, and on top of all of that, the planet in literal meltdown. And if you're a guy like me, looking at a time like now, the main thing you think is, wow, man, the 1990s were freaking glorious. Now, I know what people like you think of lawyers like me, but I'm the only one who can tell this story because I'm the only one who was there. And if you want to know it all, you can't have it all your own way. From the Olivier Award-winning co-directors of Stranger Things, The First Shadow, and Good Chance, the team behind The Jungle, comes Kyoto at the Swan Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon, from the 18th of June to the 13th of July. Book tickets now at rsc.org.uk/Kyoto.
It's the week ending Friday the 7th of June, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Sunak and Starmer going head-to-head in a TV election debate, Narendra Modi set to return as Indian Prime Minister despite his party failing to win the election, and the King leading commemorations of the 80th anniversary of D-Day. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Harriet Marsden and Rebecca Messina, and alongside them BBC sports journalist Emma Smith. Welcome everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, Harriet, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
The internet is more of a jungle than the jungle.
They've been thrown into the super stimulus without having any sort of, historical preparation to it. It's just, here is all the information, all the worst parts of human nature and the best parts just thrown at you at once. But weirdly, do you know what the most popular website is? Amazon.
That was a joke.
Fantastic.
The GB News headliners team on Wednesday digging into something, Harriet, but what? The joke landed poorly, but what did it mean?
An indigenous tribe in one of the world's most remote regions in the Amazon rainforest, which is where they were trying to go with that joke, has suddenly gained access to high-speed internet. So this is the Marubo, an indigenous tribe of about 2,000 people. They lived in one of the world's last offline places. But last September, the villagers got antenna links to connect their smartphones to satellite internet service Starlink.
Okay, but this isn't last September Unwrapped. What's happened this week?
This week, the New York Times published their findings on what 9 months of internet had done to this traditional civilization, and has published this incredible piece with these videos and pictures of this completely unfamiliar way of life, but reporting some very familiar problems.
Yes, familiar problems such as?
Well, the village elders are complaining that the young people of the tribe are completely addicted to their phones. They're just swiping for hours on end. There has been issues of misinformation, scams, pornography. This is a culture where kissing in public was inappropriate. They're now sharing explicit pornographic videos on group chats and becoming addicted to social media networks and neglecting the necessary skills to maintain their way of life, like hunting and fishing.
I mean, there are kind of two views on this, really, Emma, filtering through the comments on the New York Times website. One is, this is a tragedy. What is Elon Musk doing to the world? The other view is, what amazing technology that you truly can actually finally realise the ideals of the internet and connect the world. Which side do you fall down on?
It's interesting how the tribe want to keep the internet. I mean, there have been plenty of reported issues in the article, such as, the complaints that access to the internet is increasing levels of laziness among younger people in the tribe, and also exposing them to the worst parts of the internet, things like scams, and also the reports that access to pornography has led to more aggressive behaviour from young men towards women in the tribe. But it seems as if the tribe are in favour of keeping it, and I think that it shows that while there's a certain amount of, hand-wringing, what are we doing, bringing these Western excesses to the tribes in the Amazon, is also bringing, the good parts of the internet, connectivity to the outside world, the ability to, make calls, retain photographs and stuff like that. And it seems, therefore, that the good is outweighing the bad in this case, in which case it has to be seen as a good thing.
Do you agree, Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful to avoid sounding paternalistic when we talk about this, as though isolated people should keep doing what we think they should be doing, practicing their traditional crafts, etc., rather than actually getting to choose freely from the full range of potential options the way we do. Because, in one sense, yes, I think one sad effect of globalization and connectivity is that on the whole we are becoming a bit more homogenous culturally. Cultures are losing their unique practices as younger people sort of tune into being involved in the world at large via the internet. But also, if you and I had the choice, would we want to go back to living the way our ancestors lived before the internet? I'm sure 500 years ago they also had a beautiful culture, but most of us would choose to have social media and watch any movie we want at any time, rather than churning butter all day and then gathering in our neighbour's orchard to sing folk songs. It's so tempting to frame the encroachment of the internet as something unnatural that pollutes beautiful natural cultures and civilizations, but it is quintessentially human. We are hardwired to look for novelty and for entertainment and for stimulus. It's the same with the printing press, the radio, TV. Every new form of entertainment technology has had commentators of the time bemoaning that people no longer want to pursue traditional pastimes. I'm reminded of an article I read for preparation on the other podcast you and I do, Ollie, Today in History, with the retrospectives when we did our Monopoly episode, when Monopoly was new, in the New York Times, saying basically these new board games are great because people these days have lost the art of conversation because they'd rather listen to the radio or records.
Harriet?
I think it's also worth noting, with some of this hand-wringing about this, it's worth noting that the Marubo were not a fully isolated tribe, although 19 out of the 26 tribes in the Javari Valley indigenous territory are fully isolated. There's no roads, it's an area roughly the size of Portugal. The Marubo were not fully isolated. Many of them already had smartphones. They were already able to take photos and communicate via the internet when they were in the cities. It's also, I think, really important to note that the Marubo tribe, they all got together after Starlink came to Brazil in 2022. They all got together to discuss whether or not they wanted to ask for antenna to access the satellite internet service. And they actually wrote to Congress, to 100 different members of Congress, asking for the antenna that would allow them to do so, but none of them responded.
Because it is safer for them to have instant access to the outside world, right? And that's the main reason, really, isn't it?
Yeah, a couple of tribal members did tell the New York Times that the ability to connect to high-speed internet from their villages, from the forest, had already saved lives. In the case of, for example, a snake bite, previously they would have had to use an amateur radio to try and get a helicopter to help. Whereas now, obviously, they can immediately access that emergency contact. And also with kind of Starlink now reaching kind of 93% of the Amazon's regional municipalities, you can't be saying that there are certain parts of the Amazon that are not allowed to have the same access as others, where it's providing opportunities for education, for jobs, travel, that kind of thing. Obviously it has come with a lot of problems as well. We can talk about those more, but I do agree with Rebecca that some of it does ring slightly paternalistic.
Let's talk about Starlink then, because, our mission statement about talking about things that have kind of important consequences for all of us but may have gone under the radar really seems very relevant in this case to me, Emma, because Starlink as a business gets a lot less attention than Elon Musk's other enterprises, X and Tesla and SpaceX. I know Starlink is linked to SpaceX, obviously, because it's satellite-based. And yet, this is the thing that, as I was saying earlier, could connect the world. It could arguably do the best for his bottom line as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Aside from being one of his outlets, which seems genuinely to be helping people rather than being a little bit of an ego trip, yeah, it's so far proven to be extremely profitable. It had revenues of $4.2 billion in 2023. And there are some estimates that say that it could hit up to $6.6 billion in 2024. So while it's a relatively new part of Musk's business empire, and other parts of his business, such as SpaceX, had extremely high revenues and extremely high estimated revenues early on in their business lives before dipping slightly as output was not as great as expected. So far, Starlink seems to have been a genuine success, both for the people it's serving and for the owners and the people who, when it comes to the bottom line, as you say.
Yeah, I didn't even realise that you can, just as a UK resident, if you want to, apply to get a Starlink receiver. Obviously, it's most relevant if you live on a boat or something, because most of Britain is served by some form of high-speed internet, although, Emma, you're looking incredibly blotchy to me right now. Would you, if the prices came down, I mean, it's sort of £80 to get set up and £100 a month or something, isn't it? But if the prices come down, which they inevitably will, would you be tempted to go on Starlink just from your flat?
I suppose potentially, yeah. As you say, I'm sort of struggling along with a fairly cheap box at the moment. It is one of those things that, as it becomes a bigger name in the market, it could become a bigger player in the sort of domestic internet. But it doesn't seem as if that's the main focus for Starlink at the moment. It seems to be very much sort of playing for these sort of bigger industrial contracts and also bigger headline-catching initiatives like serving the tribes in the Amazon. But if it provides good high-speed internet for a reasonable price, it's the kind of thing that could become a more notable name in sort of the domestic market.
But also perhaps something, Rebecca, that might finally provoke some regulation on Elon Musk. You know, people have already said that Tesla and Twitter and SpaceX, all being owned by the same egocentric narcissist, is problematic. Could this be the thing that finally tips the balance?
I don't know. I mean, one of the aspects of the story that I find most interesting is how the Maribo have imposed their own restrictions already on the use of the internet. You know, one of the things that's so funny about the coverage of the story really is that so many people have said, we've had decades to adjust to the internet, and the Maribo being thrown in at the deep end, to which I don't really see how we have used all of this time to protect ourselves from the worst of the internet. And the Maribo have had it for 9 months and immediately imposed limitations to protect themselves. The internet is only available now for a couple of hours in the morning, in the evenings, and then all day Sunday. It's more a case of like we're the frogs who have slowly allowed ourselves to boil in the cauldron of the internet. Whereas, the Maribo are like the frogs who've just been thrown into the hot pot and are like, maybe we'll just keep our toes dipped in for now.
Yeah, but we're not going to follow that example, are we, Harriet? And so my point remains, is it problematic that one person owns it all?
Yeah, I think that's the main reason, apart from the incredibly interesting story, that's the main reason that I've picked this as the story of implications for everyone's lives. I think we're slightly underplaying just how much Starlink dominates the satellite internet market. And unlike the domestic internet market, what it really specializes in is bringing high-speed satellite internet to very, very remote regions in the world, like the Sahara, Mongolian desert, like Pacific Islands. Musk says that Starlink has more than 3 million users in 99 countries. We don't actually know, that's what he says. But it's used by frontline troops in Ukraine, like by a hospital in Gaza, emergency responders all over the world. But it's also used by paramilitaries in Sudan, by Houthi rebels in Yemen. And it's been great for jobs and education in the Amazon, but it's also been great for illegal loggers and miners. And what we do know is that Starlink gives Elon Musk an incomparable amount of power, globally speaking. And as you've said, he's not the sort of person that most people think can be trusted with that kind of power. I mean, just a couple of months ago, so I was saying the Ukrainian troops rely on Starlink to run their drones. But just in March, the troops were saying that they were experiencing connection problems and that Russians were increasingly able to purchase Starlink antenna to access that internet themselves. So with that in mind, based on what we've seen Musk do with the power afforded to him by being able to buy Twitter that gets around regulation, that gets around countries' own laws, why are we not a lot more worried about the fact that he now controls more than 60% of all active all the spacecraft in space, more than 60% is Starlink satellites. If he wanted to, it's not inconceivable as a very capricious, very untrustworthy and incredibly narcissistic, possibly slightly unhinged person. It's not inconceivable that he might decide, for example, to turn off the Ukrainian access to Starlink satellites. If he wanted to, is it conceivable that Elon Musk could decide the outcome of the Russian invasion? I think that is far too much power for one untrustworthy person.
This does sound like a Dr. Evil subplot now, as you describe it. I mean, Rebecca, what's kind of tantalising about this is that, if you fast forward 10 years, maybe not even, maybe 5 years, we won't be talking to Harriet about this and playing clips of GB News talking about this. We could be talking to a Maribo tribesperson, right? They could be joining us on their satellite internet. That diversity of voices that will come as a result of people in places like this being able to make TikTok videos and contribute to things on YouTube and Twitter, I mean, that might be quite significant.
Yeah, I mean, and the internet obviously as well can really help keep cultures alive. There are bigger threats to culture in the Amazon than the internet. We've talked about illegal logging, mining enterprises, etc. There are a lot of dangers, and the internet is really a great way to help preserve traditions. It can help people reconnect with their cultural history. It's a great way to learn ancestral languages that may not have many speakers anymore. And I think the example of the Maribo is particularly eye-catching because they are quite remote, and it feels like a kind of a test case. What does the internet do to people? Plus, almost every outlet has included porn in its headline. Like, this Amazon tribe got the internet, now they're addicted to porn. But, access to the internet is a huge issue for the vast majority of tribal people who are not isolated or uncontacted, but live in quite close proximity to urbanized areas, but at a major disadvantage to their neighbors in terms of access to services, healthcare, education, and programs like Starlink for all of the dangers that we've raised do have a way of levelling that playing field in a way that's going to be really, really exciting.
Okay, Rebecca, you'll be bringing us your story of international cuisine shortly. But first, it's Emma up next after this.
I think we can all agree on one thing. The times you live in are truly awful. There's food shortages, runaway inflation, culture wars, real wars, race riots, fake news, insane insurrections, global pandemics, and on top of all of that, the planet in literal meltdown. And if you're a guy like me, looking at a time like now, the main thing you think is, wow, man, the 1990s were freaking glorious. Now, I know what people like you think of lawyers like me, but I'm the only one who can tell this story because I'm the only one who was there. And if you want to know it all, you can't have it all your own way. From the Olivier Award-winning co-directors of Stranger Things, The First Shadow, and Good Chance, the team behind The Jungle, comes Kyoto at the Swan Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon from the 18th of June to the 13th of July. Book tickets now at rsc.org.uk/Kyoto.
Okay, Emma, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, the Northern Irish Assembly faced fresh questions after a media challenge.
The Minister walked the Assembly into this folly, not least by exaggerating Lord Justice Gillen's proposal. Does she accept the judicial rebuke?
Mr. Speaker, to be clear, I did not walk the Assembly into anything. The Assembly, in fact, scrutinised this legislation, and the Act is an act of this Assembly. I would also correct him in saying that I exaggerated Sir John's position. I have it in writing from Sir John in front of me, that it is not true to say that he did not recommend the new law or that I misled MLAs about his report.
There we are, refreshing after the past few years to hear the Northern Irish Parliament in session whilst the UK Parliament is suspended. But there we heard the Justice Minister for Northern Ireland, Naomi Long, fielding a question in the Northern Ireland Assembly on Monday. Emma, what was the policy she was defending there?
So, a Northern Irish law which granted anonymity to people suspected of sexual assault and other sexual offences before charge, even for 25 years after death, was struck down last Friday. And this week, the government in Stormont, as you heard there, has been facing accusations that it misled the Assembly and having to defend its position.
Yeah, so this was the Justice, Sexual Offences and Trafficking Victims Act Northern Ireland 2022. Let's unpack that and some of what you just said. So what did this law seek to do and what was the problem with it?
So what this law sought to do was protect people who had been accused of sexual offences but hadn't been charged. Followed on, it was inspired by a high-profile case in Northern Ireland in 2018 in which two former Ulster rugby players, Paddy Jackson and Stuart Olding, were charged in a high-profile rape case. Both were eventually acquitted, and it led to a discussion about how people who have been accused of sexual offences but have not been arrested or charged, how they are treated in the media and in discussion, and it led to the introduction of this bill. But what this law did was that it meant that you could not even discuss someone who had been accused of sexual offences without being charged even after they died. So in perhaps the most striking example, it would have meant that Jimmy Savile could not have been discussed in media articles as being a sexual offender.
Yeah, because the charges that were brought against him in Northern Ireland weren't then taken forward. So even though afterwards it was widely known that he did do all this stuff, because those particular charges hadn't been brought forward, even if he had been found guilty of other things that he lived, you couldn't have mentioned those ones for 25 years after he died.
Exactly. And another, and perhaps the biggest oversight in this, was that there was nothing written into the law of the media being able to challenge any sort of ruling or any part of the law. Eventually, there were two separate challenges made in the courts, which resulted in the law being struck down last Friday.
Okay, and part of that, Harriet, was because there were parts of the law that were considered incompatible with the European Convention of Human Rights. Which bit?
Well, the right to free speech and press freedom. It had two major issues, basically, that the press had no public interest defence that they could use. There was no public interest defence available to the press, so the press couldn't argue, we actually do need to publish the name of this very prominent person that's been accused of sexual assault because of public interest. So that wasn't available. The other issue was that the suspect could actually apply to have the ban lifted, but the press didn't have that same right. So if the law had been given a public interest defence, so if the press had been given the right to ask the court to set aside the anonymity, the law would still be in place. And the other part of the law that hasn't been struck down, it's still banned to publish the name of a victim of sexual assault until 25 years after their death. So if someone, just conceivably, if someone died 10 years ago and you were writing their biography, you could not write that they had claimed that they had been raped, which it's an incredibly interesting and strange piece of legislation. But as the Justice Minister was saying, as we heard her say, this legislation did go through the Assembly. She's also said that appeal is an option. So because only these two parts of the legislation have been found to be incompatible with the right to press freedom and the freedom of expression, it's not inconceivable that this legislation could be passed in some amended form.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously there are people, Rebecca, who would argue that it should be passed in some amended form. Perhaps this went too far in protecting people who are falsely accused of crimes that they didn't commit, because that's the goal of this legislation, isn't it? They don't want people's names dragged through the mud for something they then ultimately didn't do. But that ultimately there should be some way of making sure that the press can't just report on an accusation that it should only be reporting on a charge.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is this is an area where the media are well out of step with the public. A YouGov poll that was conducted after the ruling over the BBC's coverage of the raid on Sir Cliff Richard's house. So this was a moment where people were feeling a little bit more sensitive about this issue than maybe they are now. But this found that only 5% of people believe the media should be able to name someone who's under investigation but hasn't been charged. And even more surprising, a majority, over 60% of people, didn't think that they should be identified after being charged or during their trial, which is sort of more comparable to what we see in some European countries. I think Germany is one of the leading examples. I think in Germany, even when you've been convicted of a crime, you're not habitually publicly identified. As we mentioned, kind of the concern with the Northern Irish Act was that journalists weren't just opening themselves up to a potential court case to determine whether they could justify their reporting on public interest grounds. In this case, the right to anonymity was a blanket right with no public interest defence and no route to appeal. And it's part of kind of a wider trend across the UK legal system generally towards favouring Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the right to privacy, rather than Article 10, which is the right to freedom of the press. And journalists and editors have been warning that there is a trend towards blurring defamation law, which is comparatively straightforward and to which truth and public interest are defences, with this much more nebulous notion of privacy where truth is not a defence. Saying it is a fact that this person is being investigated for a sexual assault, that's not a defence under privacy law. It's not the same as defamation law, where if you can prove it's true, that in itself does constitute a defence. So publishers are arguing that the ability to report on investigations is essential, not just because it could prompt other victims to come forward, for instance, which can be really important in sexual assault cases where it's often, a case of the victim's word against the alleged perpetrators, and also for scrutiny of the police. How can you scrutinise who the police are investigating, and how, if you're only allowed to cover things which are eventually brought to trial?
The thing is, though, Harriet, people aren't just coming forward to the police, are they? Because that argument, I think, is well understood. If a public personality's name is mentioned and other people have been involved in a potential crime with that person, then that might encourage them to come forward, and then you can hear lots of disparate stories that might be completely unrelated, and you can say, this puts together a jigsaw piece. But the problem is, they do it on social media. So actually what they're doing is they're dragging someone's name through the mud together as a group, and it snowballs. And if you're the person at the centre of that, and we've seen this in some very high-profile cases this year of charges that got dropped, your career's over, everyone's had a go at you, and you've had no chance to clear your name.
Well, I think the notion of your career's over you kind of also disprove that with quite a few high-profile people who have been accused.
You've had people lose platforms, let's put it that way.
Yeah,
I'm sure they can find other platforms.
Sure,
yeah.
No, I get what you're saying, but I think it's also worth noting that this legislation would have made it impossible to publicly deny allegations either. So theoretically, someone's name could have been dragged through the mud on social media, have basically the whole world saying online that you have been accused of rape or sexual assault, but you would not have been allowed to publicly make a statement to deny that, because that would have also been prohibited. So I think that was really interesting as well. That's kind of a bit that I think has slightly gone unreported. And also this legislation would have applied retroactively. So it would have applied to anything that happened before the act was passed. So theoretically, just at a stroke, it could have become illegal to publish that Jimmy Savile was reported for sexual offences in 2013 but not charged. So retroactively, I think is a really dangerous thing to do there as well. Just one thing that I think that we haven't said is that this is a much bigger problem than Northern Ireland, because this legislation applies to anything that's readable in Northern Ireland. So that meant that, let's say if someone was being investigated in England and sent to face trial in Northern Ireland for a sexual assault crime, theoretically, we here in England could have been in trouble for reporting on that as well. So something that's lawful, even though that's lawful here, which I think demonstrates the real legal complications of devolution.
Yeah, and that explains, I guess, Emma, why you've seen a wide range of UK publishers challenging this law. So not just the ones based in Ireland, like the Belfast Telegraph and the Sunday Life, but the BBC, the Times, the Sun, the Guardian, the Daily Mail, all of them challenging this.
You read the list of the organisations which have challenged this, and it's basically all the way across the spectrum of political affiliations in the media. So one challenge was made by Media Hoist, which publishes Belfast Telegraph, Irish Independent, Sunday Life and Sunday World. Second was by the BBC alongside the Times, the Sun, the Guardian and the Daily Mail. So it's a very rare case of the Guardian and the Daily Mail working together on something, which I think shows the sort of depth of feeling in British media about how overreaching this law was.
So what does it leave us with now? What is the situation now, and what will be the situation moving forward if someone is not charged but accused of a sexual crime?
Well, we're currently unsure of that, because obviously the Justice Secretary Naomi Long indicated there that there could be an appeal from Stormont, and so we'll wait to see what form that will take and where that goes. As Harriet mentioned, there's only certain sections of the law which have been struck down. So currently there are still aspects of it which are still standing. I think that what this is it was described by Sam McBride, who's of the Belfast Telegraph, as a textbook example of good intentions which can produce bad law. It doesn't appear that it was the intention of the Northern Irish Assembly to try and stifle media reporting on people accused of sexual offences. It just seems to have been a complete oversight, and perhaps an example of how outside of journalism the rights of media to report on stuff like this isn't regarded or seen as an important issue.
What about Stormont itself? I mentioned earlier, that the Parliament was suspended for a great deal of time. What does this say about how they've been lawmaking? Because part of the problem, as I understand, was they basically rushed through this before they shut down in the first place.
Yes, so for those not wholly familiar with modern-day Northern Irish politics, the current Assembly was only formed this February, following a 22-month delay following elections in 2022. So it's very much so sort of making up for lost time to an extent in this sort of coalition mishmash of various parties that make up the government of the Assembly. And it's, there's been a number of issues that Northern Irish politics have had to deal with, most notably the the issue around Jeffrey Donaldson, who has been charged with sexual offences. It's nothing to do with this particular law, but it's basically, this is another setback to the Northern Irish Assembly in what has been quite a turbulent first half of the year.
And finally, Harriet, just to hand you a question that I know you'll sink your teeth into. For listeners who are thinking, that's all very well for journalists to sit around saying how important press freedom is because it, makes their job more profitable and interesting. But why does it matter to me? Why is it important that the press can report this stuff?
Well, in this particular case, with sexual offences, absolutely above all, sexual offences, assault, rape, it is statistically almost impossible to get recourse or justice through the courts. It is almost impossible to get a rape conviction. It is almost impossible to get a sexual offences or assault conviction. That leaves victims with only one option, and that is to use the press, especially when it's against prominent or powerful people. Like, obviously, I, as a journalist, would defend the freedom of the press and a free press as an unbelievably important part of any functioning democracy, and you can see that around the world. But also, as a woman, or as anyone who may or may not ever need to report a sexual offence or assault or a rape, I know that there is no recourse through the police, and I know that there is very little recourse through the courts. So what does that leave me if it's a very prominent person? If it's a politician, for example, or a powerful person like Jimmy Savile, or a very famous person, potentially with a lot of responsibility, potentially with access to a lot of vulnerable people, if the government continues to try and stifle the freedom of the press, and of course it's difficult to balance the individual right to privacy with the right to a free press. It's often complicated and it's often subjective. But I don't believe that this was an oversight. I don't believe that this was a government oversight. It's never a government oversight to try and stifle free press reporting. And especially in this particular type of crime, if you further stifle the ability of the press to report on this type of thing, then that leaves victims with pretty much nowhere else to go.
Indeed. We'll be pivoting to international gastronomy after this. Rebecca, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Forget andouillette and foie gras, pass the patatas bravas.
Only eating croissants in Paris for the entire day.
Now, to make this challenge happen, I spent the day collecting as many croissants as humanly possible.
Allegedly, this is the best croissant in all of Paris.
It's so buttery. Throughout the day, I had a total of 24 croissants. I'm talking regular, chocolate, almond. Honestly, it got to the point that I wasn't even sure what flavor croissant I was putting in my mouth.
I have no idea what this is.
All I knew was each bite was better than the last. I know they say Paris is all about the museums, but I honestly think the real art is hanging in my stomach.
Remind me again what the benefits of giving the internet to the world are. Only eating croissants in Paris for 24 hours. A video by TikToker Matt Peterson posted on Monday. Rebecca, why? Why did we hear that?
So this week we got the results of a massive survey of around 30,000 people from 30 countries around the world by Harris Interactive for Atout France, the French tourism board. Respondents were asked about various aspects of holiday destinations, including food, accommodation, attractions, and found that shockingly, in terms of cuisine, France was ranked third behind Spain and Italy. There was something for the French to cling to, because when asked specifically about high-end restaurants, France did retain the number one spot, but this has caused consternation in France.
Sacre bleu. So is the story here that the French tourist board shot themselves in the foot by asking this question, that they must have assumed that the answer would be France would be number one?
Yeah, I think we can safely say that Philippe Gloegen, the founder of the Guide du Routard, which is one of France's major culinary guides, called it ill-advised. He claims the problem is that tour operators are booking visitors into subpar brasseries, which I've got to say smells like, as the kids would say, cope. But it is true that 42% of visitors to France come to Paris, and that the capital is infested with subpar tourist traps. So, there have been other comments in the French media linking kind of the falling stature of the French culinary industry to huge recruitment problems in hospitality. France currently has a 200,000 person shortfall in employment in that sector.
Okay, and as those of us aged 35 plus Google the word cope, I will ask you, Harriet, is French food not as good as it once was?
No, I think it's better than it once was. So this is a very personal story for me, because I see France as kind of like my second adopted country. I've got family in France. I've spent part or all of every summer in France since I was a little kid.
My dad was a tool maker. I know what it's like to be struggling.
Exactly. It's such a struggle to spend your summers in the south of France, like, honestly. And I can say that for many, many, many years, regardless of whatever the reputation for high-end gastronomic French food was, for many years, it was basically meat, bread, potatoes, salad, butter, cream, cheese. Very few spices, very little variety, very few vegetables. Like, I used to come home and all I'd want was a whole load of broccoli and carrots. You'd ask for vegetables, they'd give you a salad and chips. Honestly, there was so little variety. And when you compare it to somewhere like Spain, which I've lived in and which I've spent a lot of time in, and the unbelievable regional variety there, just in terms of food and language and everything. But over the past 5 to 10 years, France, it's got so much more variety than it did. So much more Syrian influence, a lot of Asian food coming in the south, a lot more acceptance of vegans and vegetarians, but still very little acceptance of vegans and vegetarians. It's still a very difficult place if you've got any kind of, especially outside the cities. So no, I don't think French food has got worse. I think it's got significantly better, but I don't think that it has improved nearly as fast as it needs to compare with like Spain or Italy or Asia or South America, for example.
Okay, so maybe it's not about the actual food at all, Emma, but the environment. And I was thinking about this myself as someone who for the past 2 summers has travelled on holiday to that border between Spain and France. So I've flown into Barcelona, driven into France for a bit, spent a bit of time in Spain. And I'd say the difference between the cuisines isn't about the quality, it's just about the fact you can just relax. I mean, France is just more uptight, and this isn't in the cities, this is out in the sticks. France is more uptight, they take gastronomy so seriously, whereas Spain is just, especially as a tourist, more laid back, more fun, have what you want, have lunch at 4 o'clock. I mean, as a tourist, it's just easier to eat in Spain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of also speaks to the sort of modern attitude towards food. Things like street food are becoming a lot more popular. People are dining in a much more relaxed way in general than they used to, which suits somewhere like Spain. It suits a dining culture which is like things like tapas, smaller plates, a more relaxed attitude than the French, sort of like the sit down, have a very sort of set type of food, set number of courses. And I think that there is also, as Rebecca says, a certain amount of complacency from France, that the assumption that they are the world leaders in food and sort of have so much cultural identity tied up into that. But in the end, there is a slight element to which it is, the French attitude to cuisine is slightly anachronistic now.
And hospitality as well, Rebecca. It's just, of course I'm dealing with stereotypes here, but, this survey asks people to generalise. You do get that feeling in France. You're more likely to be scowled at by the waiter if you don't speak the language or if you order the wrong thing.
Yeah, so this was another area that France came up short in the survey. France was also rated low on politeness and warmness of welcome, which are not great with the Olympics on the horizon. 15 million visitors are expected to France over the summer. But what was quite funny was that Caroline Le Boucher from Atout France was asked about those findings on French people giving tourists poor welcome, and she basically replied like, yeah, we get that a lot. This has been going on forever. They have really been trying to turn this perception of France around. Way back in 2008, the city of Paris organised a giant human smile formed by people holding red umbrellas at the Arc de Triomphe to launch a new campaign called Paris Smiles on You. The tourism board has recently been re-releasing videos that were originally made for the Rugby World Cup ahead of the Olympics, explaining how to act with foreign tourists, how to make people from different countries feel welcome. For the Brits, they suggest not talking about the royal family, talking instead about the weather, making sure that their hotel room has a kettle and tea bags in it. But I think the problem is that it is partly self-fulfilling, right? Like, people come to France and to Paris in particular expecting rudeness, and if you're expecting rudeness, then you will find it. So your perception will be reinforced. It doesn't matter how many people welcome you warmly when you're in Paris, that one person that sneers and you're like, the classic Parisian sneer. So they are fighting a little bit of a losing battle on that front, especially when, Spain and Italy both have a much friendlier reputation. So you're going in with your guard, I think, that little bit lowered as well.
Harriet, you're frowning.
I'm like a French woman.
I've spent I'm gonna get in a lot of trouble with certain people for saying this, but I've spent a lot of time in Paris and I have rarely encountered anything but rudeness. I speak French and I'm telling you that it's this kind of overwhelming sense of cultural superiority. This I don't think that tourists appreciate being made to feel unchic and uncultured, which is, I think, and I know it's a massive generalization, and I'm not saying that there aren't friendly people, but that is the overwhelming sentiment that you feel when you're in France, is that you are badly dressed, overweight, overeating, unchic, uncultured tourist. And there's just as many rude people in Italy and Spain, but there is not that same sense of you are absolute scum. Like, don't even come in here with your terrible outfit. And and I say this with so much love for France, I do, but they really just don't help themselves.
And yet, Rebecca, does France really have anything to worry about? Can it just do a big old Gallic shrug? Because, as you said, they've got the Olympics, and they're the most popular tourist destination in the world.
Yeah, 100 million visitors a year, and they've held that title, most visited country in the world, for 30 years. There were a lot of positives that came out of the survey as well. You know, I think what we are seeing is probably, this is the tail end of French cuisine being a byword for the ultimate in gastronomy. You know, despite the rise of, as we've said, global cuisines over the last, really, we're talking decades at this point, that French food has really been challenged for that position. Despite all of that, if you see a cartoon in a newspaper that's set in a French restaurant, or a TV scene where characters walking into a French restaurant with a little accordion flourish, we immediately understand, oh, this is fancy, this is good food, this is a special occasion. I do think we are seeing the tail end of that being a given, of that being an understandable stereotype. I think future generations probably won't make that connection. But I think what France does still have going for it, according to the survey, is fine dining, which obviously, has been associated with France for forever at this point. Wine tastings, shopping, and actually theme parks, weirdly. Theme parks, it was rated number one.
Disneyland Paris, Rebecca, biggest theme park in Europe.
Yeah. I mean, dream big, guys. There's like a million of them in America. But yeah, so France still has plenty going for it. I don't think it's going to lose its top spot anytime soon. One thing that I did think was interesting that came out of the survey as well was that when they divided the respondents into their home countries, so you had respondents from all these different countries, 8 countries out of the 30 that were surveyed listed Italy as being the destination they would most like to visit. That was the number one most desired destination.
I blame Stanley Tucci for this personally. Like he's mixed together the gastronomy and the tourism into
Italy's been on a real roll lately, I have to say. But of the 3 countries that still rated France as their number one destination to visit, China was one of the 3. And I do think that where France does retain that kind of cultural preeminence is outside of Europe. I think in Europe they are really seeing their cultural domination decline severely, whereas in China, Japan, etc., that sort of French dream is still very much a prominent thing in the culture.
Let's just speak up for French cuisine as we end the show. Harriet, what is the best thing you've ever eaten in France? Give us a dish. Give us an incident.
I mean, it sticks out in my mind so much. It's a market in Antibes, fresh king crab, just as it was, glass of white wine, fresh baguette, fresh butter, fresh crab and green salad, and it was just perfect. I will remember it forever.
Emma?
Well, I haven't been to France nearly as much as Harriet. I haven't been for years, although I am actually going back this summer for the Paralympics, which I'm very much looking forward to. Yeah. So I'll have to sort of sample some of the French cuisine.
You must have munched on a croissant, Emma. What's the best thing you've eaten in France?
I must have done. Yeah, again, to end on a stereotype, went on holiday to Nice, and there was a boulangerie around the corner, and being able to go and get fresh baguettes every morning was nice.
Rebecca?
Le Relais Gascon. There's 2 branches. They're both in Montmartre. They do this thing called a salade géante. It's a gigantic wooden bowl.
Specific.
The entire bottom of this salad is fried potatoes, and then they just pile fillings on top with like a couple of lettuce leaves, and that's just salad.
Do you see what I mean, though? This is exactly what I'm talking
I literally
about.
have just said back the exact thing you said you disliked about French food.
My favourite thing, and I can't tell you what it's called in French, and I can't even tell you the restaurant that I got it, but I went to an area of Normandy where when you ordered a burger, it came with samphire on it, like pickled samphire on the burger from the region.
I've just remembered my favourite.
They call it salicon or something. Go on quickly, Harriet.
My favourite French dish, tartiflette.
Right.
Oh my God, it is incredible.
Let's stop doing this.
You had to let Harriet go twice.
Yeah.
Because she's been so cruel to the French.
Okay, that's it. Cheese course. My thanks to Harriet, Rebecca and Emma. You can follow this show for free. You can get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription when you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, au revoir.
I think we can all agree on one thing. The times you live in are truly awful. There's food shortages, runaway inflation, culture wars, real wars, race riots, fake news, insane insurrections, global pandemics, and on top of all of that, a planet in literal meltdown. And if you're a guy like me, looking at a time like now, the main thing you think is, wow, man, the 1990s were freaking glorious. Now, I know what people like you think of lawyers like me, but I'm the only one who can tell this story because I'm the only one who was there. And if you want to know it all, you can't have it all your own way. From the Olivier Award-winning co-directors of Stranger Things, The First Shadow, and Good Chance, the team behind The Jungle, comes Kyoto at the Swan Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon from the 18th of June to the 13th of July. Book tickets now at rsc.org.uk/Kyoto.